August 20th, 1982. The Dominican Republic, the Altos de Chavon amphitheater. 5,000 people sat in the suffocating Caribbean heat, their faces glowing in the amber light of the stage rig. They were witnessing royalty, not a prince or a king of a nation, but the undisputed chairman of the board. Frank Sinatra was 66 years old, sweating through his tuxedo, fighting a humidity that clung to his vocal cords like a heavy wool blanket. The crowd roared as he launched into the opening bars of "I've Got You Under My Skin." It was the sound of pure adoration. But under the lights, behind the sapphire eyes that had charmed the world for 40 years, panic was setting in. He reached for a high note, a note he had hit 10,000 times in his sleep, and it wasn't there. The voice, the Stradivarius of the 20th century, cracked. It was a microscopic fracture, barely audible to the untrained ear, but to Frank, it sounded like a gunshot. He smiled, he covered it with a rhythmic shrug, he played the part. But the 5,000 people in that stone amphitheater didn't know that they were watching a man who was terrified that the music was finally stopping. By the way, tell me in the comments, which city are you watching from? To understand the weight pressing down on Frank Sinatra's shoulders that night in 1982, you have to understand the ghosts that were standing in the wings. By the early 80s, Frank wasn't just a singer, he was a monument. He was expected to be bulletproof, timeless, and perfect every single night. But the man inside the tuxedo was mortal. He was losing his friends, he was losing his breath, and most deeply, he was still running from the shadow of the one person who had defined his entire existence. His mother, Dolly. The world saw the swagger and the Jack Daniels and the broads. They didn't see the insomnia. They didn't see the nights in hotel suites from London to Las Vegas where Frank sat in a silk robe, staring at a silent telephone, terrified of the quiet. The silence was where the truth lived, and Frank Sinatra had spent a lifetime making enough noise to drown it out. If you love stories about the legends behind the music, subscribe for new stories. The months leading up to the concert for the Americas had been grueling. The press was whispering. They called him the fading idol. They dissected his hairline, his weight, his temper. Frank read the papers. He pretended not to, throwing them across the room in fits of rage, but he knew what they were saying. He should retire. He's a caricature. The voice is gone. To a man whose entire identity was built on being the best, on being the champion. These weren't just insults. They were existential threats. He pushed himself harder. He added dates to the tour. He drank more to numb the throat pain. He rehearsed until the orchestra was exhausted, snapping at musicians who missed a beat by a millisecond. He was trying to outrun time, but time is the only predator that never gets tired. On the afternoon of the show, the atmosphere backstage was thick with tension. Frank was pacing his dressing room like a caged tiger. The humidity was wreaking havoc on his sinuses. He snapped at his longtime friend and road manager, Jilly Rizzo. "The air is too thick, Jilly. How am I supposed to breathe in this soup?" Jilly tried to calm him down, pouring a precise measure of Chivas, but Frank waved it away. This wasn't just stage fright. This was the deep, gnawing dread of a gladiator who knows his sword is dull, but who has to walk into the arena anyway. He looked in the mirror, adjusting his bow tie, staring into those blue eyes. "You're Frank Sinatra," he whispered to the reflection. But for the first time in decades, he wasn't sure if the man in the mirror believed him. The show began with the usual electric energy. When he walked out, the ovation was physical, a wave of sound that hit him in the chest. He started strong. All or nothing at all. Strangers in the night. The technique was still there, the impeccable phrasing that could turn a pop song into a 3-act play. But as the set progressed, the cracks began to show. He was sweating profusely, wiping his brow with a handkerchief more often than usual. He was cutting notes short, avoiding the sustain, relying on the brass section to cover the gaps where his breath should have been. The band, the best in the business, adjusted in real time. They watched his shoulders, his hands, his eyes, predicting his fatigue, swelling the volume to hold him up. It was a high-wire act, performed without a net. Then came the moment that changed the night. He was introducing a ballad, one of the torch songs that usually brought the house down. He stood at the microphone, the spotlight isolating him against the dark Caribbean sky. He started to tell a joke, one of the standard saloon singer bits he'd done 1,000 times, but he stopped. He looked out at the faces in the front row. Strangers, fans, people who wanted a piece of him. He looked at the orchestra. He looked down at his polished shoes. The script in his head, the one that had run on autopilot for 40 years, suddenly vanished. The silence stretched out. 3 seconds, 5 seconds, 10 seconds. In the world of show business, 10 seconds of silence is an eternity. The conductor raised his baton, confused, waiting for a cue that wasn't coming. "You know," Frank said, his voice dropping to a register that wasn't the booming baritone of the chairman, but the raspy, quiet voice of a man from Hoboken. You spend your whole life trying to be the guy everyone wants you to be. You put on the suit, you sing the songs, you smile when your heart is breaking. He paused, and his hand trembled slightly as he reached for a glass of water on the piano. I haven't sung this next song in a long time. I took it out of the book because it hurts. But tonight, I think I need to sing it for her. The audience didn't make a sound. They knew. They didn't know the details, but they knew the her wasn't a lover. It wasn't Ava or Mia or Barbara. It was Dolly. Dolly Sinatra, the firebrand mother who had forged him, pushed him, and loved him with a violence that matched his own ambition. She had died in a plane crash on a snowy mountain in 1977, 5 years earlier. Frank had gone on stage immediately after her death. He had worked through the grief. He had never stopped. He had never truly cried in front of an audience. He had bottled that Italian thunder and let it fuel the rage in his songs, but he had never let it break him, until now. Subscribe for new stories to join our community of history lovers. He turned to the pianist, Bill Miller, who had been with him since the beginning. Frank whispered a title that wasn't on the set list. Bill's eyes widened slightly, but he nodded. He played a soft, dissonant chord. Frank loosened his tie, a gesture that was usually theatrical, but this time felt like he was trying to keep from suffocating. The song was Softly As I Leave You. Usually, Frank performed it as a semi-spoken dramatic piece about a dying man, but tonight, he didn't act it. He lived it. As the music swelled, Frank Sinatra stripped away the chairman. He wasn't cool. He wasn't swinging. He was a 66-year-old orphan standing in the humidity, mourning the woman who had taught him how to fight. When he reached the climax of the song, the part where the narrator says goodbye, Frank's voice didn't just crack, it shattered. Tears, genuine and unchecked, rolled down the face of the toughest man in Hollywood. He didn't wipe them away. He let the world see them. He gripped the microphone stand not as a prop, but as a crutch, the only thing keeping him upright on the spinning earth. The audience was paralyzed. They had paid to see the legend. They were getting the human. It was uncomfortable. It was voyeuristic. It was the most beautiful thing he had ever done. For 3 minutes, the invincible Frank Sinatra was just a boy missing his mother. When the final note faded, a whisper that seemed to hang in the humid air forever, Frank didn't bow. He stood there, head bowed, shoulders heaving. The silence that followed was heavier than the applause that eventually broke it. It wasn't the polite applause of a concert. It was the thunderous, weeping ovation of a crowd that had just been touched by something sacred. Frank finished the show. He was a professional, and the show must go on. He rallied for New York, New York, kicking his leg high, belting the final notes with a defiance that felt earned. But something had shifted. As he walked off stage, drenched in sweat, collapsing into the arms of Jilly Rizzo, he wasn't the same man who had walked on. He had let the mask slip. He had survived it. But the story doesn't end in the Dominican Republic. That night was a warning, a prelude to the inevitable. The years that followed were a slow, graceful, and sometimes painful decline. Frank kept touring. He kept singing. He refused to stop because stopping meant facing the silence permanently. But the physical toll was mounting. The memory lapses became more frequent. The teleprompters got bigger. The bad nights happened more often than the good ones. Yet, the fans stayed. They didn't come for the perfect voice anymore. They came to be in the room with the history. They came to say thank you. If you are enjoying this journey into the life of Frank Sinatra, please subscribe for new stories. 12 years later, 1994, Richmond, Virginia, the Mosque Theater. Frank was 78 years old. The heat in the theater was oppressive, just like it had been in the Dominican Republic. Frank was singing My Way, the anthem that had defined his stubborn, glorious life. He reached the end of the song, the final crescendo, the moment of triumph. He stood by the stool, wiping his brow. He looked out at the crowd, confused. The heat was swimming in his vision. He called out to his son, Frank Jr., who was conducting the orchestra. "I'm not doing too well," he said. And then the chairman of the board fell. He collapsed on stage, hitting the floor with a heavy thud. The music stopped. The audience screamed. The lights stayed on, illuminating the fallen giant. People rushed to the stage. For a terrifying few minutes, the world thought they had just witnessed the death of Frank Sinatra. He hadn't died. It was extreme dehydration and exhaustion, but in a way, something did end that night in Richmond. It was the final curtain call of the touring life. He would never perform a full public concert again. The Richmond collapse was the physical end, but the spiritual climax had been that night in the Dominican Republic years earlier. That was the night he made peace with his vulnerability. In the years after Richmond, Frank retreated to his compound in Palm Springs. The silence he had feared for so long finally caught him. But those who were with him at the end said he wasn't afraid anymore. He sat by the pool, listening to the desert wind, surrounded by the memories of a life that was too big for one man to hold. Untold. Frank Sinatra died on May 14, 1998. The world stopped. The lights on the Las Vegas Strip were dimmed in his honor. But the true legacy wasn't the lights, or the records, or the movies. It was the fact that a skinny kid from Hoboken had sung the truth of the human condition so loudly that the whole world had no choice but to listen. He taught us that it's okay to be arrogant, and it's okay to be broken, sometimes in the same breath. Subscribe for new stories if you want to explore more lives of the legends. That night, in 1982, when he stopped the show to sing for Dolly, he gave us the key to understanding him. He wasn't singing to the crowd. He wasn't singing for the money. He was singing to bridge the gap between the man he was and the people he had lost. He was trying, note by note, to heal himself. And isn't that what we're all doing? Before you go, I have one last request. Subscribe for new stories and share this video with someone who loves real music. Frank Sinatra spent his life doing it his way, but in the end, he showed us that the only way that matters is the honest way. Thanks for watching.